I'm Julia Cooper. I'm from the Organic Research Centre, and welcome to the session we're sponsoring today called Full of Beans, all about how we can integrate more beans and, well, pulses into market gardens. And before we came to the OGG, when we were thinking about topics, I wasn't sure about the idea of pulses, dry beans, in market gardens, and whether that would even be something people would be interested in. But since I've talked to our three speakers in the course of getting this session together, I've realized that, yeah, there's lots of opportunities to get more pulses into our market gardening system. So we're going to hear from Nick Saltmarsh, first of all, from Hodmedod's about markets for interesting types of pulses. And then, who have we got next? I think we're going to have Imelda next from the University of Reading, talking about how to grow beans and about intercropping and all the great benefits we get from beans in our cropping systems when we intercrop. And Isabel's going to talk about our work in the Organic Research Centre around trying to find the best varieties of beans, particularly for organic systems, and the sorts of challenges we have with growing beans in organic systems and the traits that we're looking for. So each person's going to have about 10 minutes for their spiel, and that will leave us lots of time for questions and discussion. So I'm really hoping that while you're listening, you'll all be thinking of good questions to ask, because it's always my fear that at the end of, that there'll be like 20 minutes of dead silence at the end of some session I've led. And so to mitigate that, I generally have a long list of my own questions, which are not really very interesting, probably. So hopefully you'll have some good questions. So Nick, you're going to start. I'll hand the mic over to you.
Thanks very much. Hello everyone, so I'm Nick Saltmarsh. I'm one of the three founders of Hodmedod. I haven't got any slides, you've just got my logo there, but I have got some props which I will produce and perhaps pass around so you can have a look at the pulses that I'm talking about. So I'm going to start off talking not about pulses in market gardens, because the vast majority of pulses that are grown in the UK are field crops grown in arable rotations. And that's primarily what we work with. So I'm going to just sort of talk about that fairly briefly, trying not to ramble on too much about the wonders of peas. But then I'll talk about where we see and have sort of dabbled with some opportunities for different types of pulses that really lend themselves better in the UK to being grown in more of a sort of horticultural system. So we started Hodmedod back in 2012, essentially because we realised that there were pulses being grown in arable farming in the UK, but really very little eaten here, particularly the field bean or fava bean, which is my first prop. So these are fava beans, generally known as field beans. They grow in fields, as the name suggests. If you don't mind. So they're a common crop, grown widely, used a lot for animal feed, even for feeding salmon, believe it or not. But the best quality beans for a long time have been sold for export for human consumption, in particularly countries like Egypt, where they really appreciate these beans. But we barely eat them in the UK. We stopped eating them a few hundred years ago, and they became stigmatised as the food of the poor because everyone who could afford to would prefer to eat meat and dairy, didn't need to eat the beans for protein. So they really fell out of our diets, though farmers kept growing them, because like all pulses, they're fantastic at adding fertility, bringing fertility into the soil by fixing nitrogen, and are great as a break crop, really good in arable rotations. So those are fava beans, and they really are the only type of bean that can be grown commercially in the UK on a field scale. What we're much better at growing in the UK, rather than other types of beans, are different types of peas. And Britain is in fact a fantastic place to grow peas. They are a crop that always needs attention, but we can grow. We tend to think of peas mainly either as mushy peas in the fish and chip shop, or more commonly as fresh or frozen green peas, which are the immature peas picked before they've fully ripened, matured and dried. And there's a research centre up the road from us in East Anglia in Norwich, the John Innes Centre, where Professor Dolmoni, who dedicates her life to studying peas, calls the fresh peas, rather than the dried ones, little bags of sugar, because that's the point at which they're just full of sugar and it hasn't turned into starch. They're actually much more nutritious, much more versatile, and much more varied if they're left to dry. And there are many different varieties of all different colours that you can see in this. This is what we call all the peas, although it's not actually all the peas. There are other varieties that aren't in there. But I've bought several. I've got lots of peas. So those are all the peas. We've got blue peas, which they're blue because the skin gives them a bluish tinge. If you take the skin off and cut them in half, they turn into split green peas. We've got marrowfat peas, so they're the one variety that we do still eat a reasonable amount of as a pea that's harvested dry rather than fresh, and in mushy peas primarily. And then we've got probably the best of the lot. We've got Carlin peas. These are you can see a sort of dark brown variety. They're also known as maple peas or black peas. If anyone from Lancashire, they probably know of black peas, but they're very little known in other parts of the country. Used to be widely eaten. They have a fantastic sort of nutty flavour and quite firm texture, and they really are the British equivalent to chickpeas. You can use them in any way that chickpeas are used. In the north of England, they're often cooked as what's called parched peas, which sounds like they should be dry, but they're not. They're actually cooked and served in a little cup with their liquor and a bit of vinegar. You can still buy them on Preston Market. There's a little stall there selling parched peas, so if you're ever in Preston, make sure you try them. And these are just a different Carlin pea, which is a redder variety. Those ones, the dark ones, we call black badgers, which is an old dialect name for them. These ones we call red foxes for obvious reasons. We have had customers ask us if any badgers or foxes were involved in the production, which they're not. So those are the main commercial pulses that are fairly widely produced in the UK, although we should be growing a lot more of them. We could be growing 10 times the amount of pulses, and the more pulses we can get into any rotation, the better. So that's what we are really all about, is trying to encourage people to eat more pulses, so farmers have a reason to grow more pulses, and we get the benefits on the farm, but also benefits for us, because pulses are among the most nutritious and healthy foods, as well as being absolutely delicious. So although those are the main pulses grown in the UK, they're not the main ones that we eat. We prefer imported pulses. We love chickpeas, we love baked beans, but probably the less said about them, the better. The baked beans are all made from imported navy beans or haricot beans, mainly grown in Canada, the US, and even sometimes Ethiopia produces navy beans to go into British baked beans. There's very little British about baked beans, even though they're probably thought by many to be our sort of national food. So we like baked beans, we like chickpeas, we like lentils. So we've tried growing all of these, although there's no tradition of growing them in the UK. Lentils we've had some success with, growing on a field scale. They can be grown. Lentils are grown fairly widely in France, and there's not a huge difference between our climate and the French climate. And lentils do grow well here. There's a bit of variation in quality from year to year, and we're still sort of working with farmers to find the best ways of growing them. Chickpeas are more challenging because chickpeas are grown a little bit in France, more in Spain, and more sort of more widely around the world. Spanish chickpea farmers have a saying that chickpeas only like to see water at their birth and at their death. The birth is when you sow the chickpea and it needs a little bit of water to get it growing. The death is when you put the chickpeas in boiling water to cook them. So they don't really like any water in between, and in the UK they do see water in between. So we do struggle with chickpeas. These ones here that I'm going to pass around, I'll throw you the lentils first. Those aren't the best lentils. That's from last year's harvest, which wasn't the best quality. These actually are the best chickpeas we've managed to grow in the UK. So they are a very nice looking chickpea, but they're not always like this. And some years the crop just completely fails. So the lentils and chickpeas are still very much work in progress. So those are field pulses, but I'm not really here to talk about those. I'm here to talk about the types of pulses that might be grown in a more market garden situation. So the other pulses that we love to eat in the UK, and rightly so, because they are absolutely delicious and exciting and versatile and come in all sorts of different varieties and colours and flavours, are the Phaseolus species. So the peas, in fact, all the ones that I've talked about so far are all what we might call old world pulses. They all essentially originated in the Fertile Crescent, the dawn of farming on this side of the Atlantic. Phaseolus pulses all originate in the Americas and have been cultivated since the dawn of farming that happened over on that side of the world. And the Phaseolus, there are two main Phaseolus species. Phaseolus vulgaris, the common bean, that's what we call a French bean if we grow it and pick it, sort of the green immature pods to eat. But there are many different varieties. They have huge genetic diversity. So you can see I've got a few different varieties. There's cannellini, which are a small white. Can I throw these? Yeah. Let's hope we don't spill the beans. So those are quite a sort of plain, simple variety. But then we've got some of them just have amazing patterning and colouring. These are what are called yin-yang beans, because they have a sort of black. They're also called orca beans because they look a bit like a killer whale or a yin-yang, and exactly the same species as the cannellini, but different variety, and sort of showing the genetic diversity of them. And these are Belotti, which you're probably familiar with, very popular in Italy. And then we've got a small kidney bean, a red bean, and these are really just a few of the literally hundreds of varieties. There are black beans. There are even what are called soldier beans, where the colouring on the bean actually looks like a little person or a little soldier along the sort of hilum, the edge of the bean. Many different varieties, and lots of sort of associations with different parts of the world where these beans have been grown and bred, and different varieties have been taken on and adopted as the sort of favoured, most beloved bean, if I hadn't, but I haven't, of that area. And these Phaseolus beans are the ones that is really virtually impossible. People have tried, we've done trials with farmers, but they really are virtually impossible to grow on a field scale in the UK. You might have a good year, or if you're very lucky, a couple of good years where you'll get a crop, manage to harvest it, but really the growing season is just too long that it pushes the boundaries of our British growing season. They're frost sensitive, so they can't be sown too early, and they don't like it when it gets cold and damp at the end of the season. So the problem is that you have to sow them so late that they don't really mature until you're into the autumn. Then it gets cold and damp, and if the pods really get damp when the beans are drying, then you can get rot setting in, and just the beans deteriorate, and they're not good for anything. So on a field scale, it's a real struggle. There are various breeding programs to try and shorten the growing period, because even just taking 5 or so days off the length of time they need to grow would be a massive benefit. And there are ongoing trials. There are research projects going on at the moment on different varieties of these Phaseolus beans to see if there is one that can be grown reliably on a field scale. But it's really challenging. However, in a horticultural system, it's different, because it can grow in a more protected environment, potentially even undercover and in polytunnels, for example. And it can also, can be given more attention. So they can be harvested by hand. It is a labour-intensive process, but because these beans are so prized and so rare as a British crop, they do have a very high value. So there is the potential of producing a very high value dried pulse crop by growing them in a market garden system. Possibly also picking some of the immature beans to sell or use as fresh green beans as they're growing, but then leaving some or potentially all of them to grow on and ripen. On a small scale as well, if it starts to turn cold and damp before the beans are fully dried, rather than harvesting the individual pods, which then obviously have to be shelled to get the beans out, you can harvest the whole plant and just hang or suspend the bean plants in a suitably sort of dry environment, and they will dry then over the following weeks or even months, and can then later be shelled and the beans can be removed. I know I'm short on time, but I just want to also mention that there's another species of Phaseolus bean called Phaseolus coccineus, which we know as the runner bean. And again, we know this and primarily grow this as a fresh green bean. But runner beans, I would say, produce the most delicious dried beans of all, particularly the white-seeded varieties. There are a couple of varieties called Emergo and Czar, which are white-seeded and produce the most amazing, what a lot of people would call butter beans, but they are far superior to butter beans, which are a different type of bean, a different species altogether, the lima bean. The runner beans is really closer to what the Greeks called gigantes beans, which are a particularly large-seeded variety of these white-seeded runner beans. And as the Greeks appreciate, and if any of you have tried them, I'm sure you also appreciate, they are a supremely delicious, fantastic textured bean. So growing runner beans on as a dried bean, especially the white-seeded varieties, is really something that I think has a lot of potential within market garden systems to reduce what is potentially one of the highest value beans of all, the dried white large runner beans. And just to give an indication of the potential value of these beans, which really justifies growing them in a horticultural system rather than an arable system, the ex-farm price for the field beans that I started off with is about, for non-organic beans, it's about 250 to 300 pounds a tonne, and a couple of £100 more for beans from an organic system. For the Phaseolus beans, they are potentially worth more like 1,500 or even more pounds a tonne. So there's a significant difference in the value, which really makes it potentially feasible to grow these beans in market garden systems. I think that there should be local markets for them anywhere. I mean, we have just a few small growers who grow some of these beans for us, and whenever we have them available, which is not often because they are grown in such small quantities, the level of interest from people is just extraordinary. People just love these beans, love to get them when they can. So I think there are potential local markets everywhere for them. And if any of your growers are keen to grow lots of beans and you have more than you can sell locally, then we're always keen to have other growers growing beans for us. So there's a market there, and I hope I've given you just a taste of what the potential might be. Anyway, I'll hand over to the next speaker, who I think is going to go more into the growing side
it's
of
Imelda,
things.
right? You're going to go next? Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks, Nick. Right, Nick's done a great job of, I think, convincing all of us, especially with that final point on the value of the crop, that there's definitely potential to grow more pulses in market gardens. And now Imelda is going to talk to us a little bit about the many benefits of intercropping with beans.
Thank you. So I was planning to present some of the result of my research, but I'm going to kind of modify this a little bit and kind of talk about, some of the research we've done, which is more in line with what you just talked about. When I was invited by Julia to come and talk here, I realized that I didn't know much about incorporating pulses in market gardens. So I was in Belgium, I'm from Belgium. I was visiting my brother 2 weeks ago when I got invited. So I went and visited this garden, which is kind of where, this is the guy, Jean-Luc, who feeds his family. And I wanted to know how he was incorporating legumes into his garden. And he was doing really wonderful work, because this was a field that usually was a kind of train trucks, and he's trying to restore the land and grow food, and has a wonderful project. So I was really fascinated by kind of seeing the power of legumes, essentially, because he's using them quite a lot to try and reclaim the land. So he's growing beans and soybeans, we heard a little bit about how wonderful these beans are, and you were kind of talking about the origin of beans from Mesoamerica, and they were often grown in this system called the milpa, which is a millennial-old system, and it was actually kind of growing beans, with squash, with corn as well, and they were kind of using sort of the synergy between the different crops to kind of help each other in sort of growing above ground but also below ground, helping the soil. And so this kind of goes back really like millennia old. And I was looking into whether this system, so I'm interested in intercropping, which is growing multiple crops together at the same time. And this was really a practice that originated from Mesoamerica thousands of years ago. But I was also interested in knowing whether this practice was also took place in the British agricultural system. And I found this system called muslin in English, or mushroom in Scotland. And so where the growers, the farmers were integrating these different types of cereal, but also legumes, and a lot of the time they were growing these together to make a special flour that was then used for bread making, but also some of the parts of the plants were used for animal feed. So I thought it was actually quite cool to kind of see how these millennia-old practices are coming back as a way to in this climate emergency situation we're in, as a way to restore the soils, as a way to feed the people. So I thought it was really wonderful to kind of go back in time. And I was really interested in that. And so that's what I work on. And I'm based at the University of Reading. I do research there, and at the moment, we're part of this European project called Leguminose, and it's really trying to take these millennia-old systems, which were often practiced on small allotments, like you would in a market garden, but trying to have this, scaling it up on a kind of more arable system, going from horticultural to arable systems. So we are working on this project called Leguminose. If you want to find out more about Leguminose, please check the website. So we have a few field trials at the University of Reading. This is beautiful, Natalie, visiting the field, and we're basically comparing the performance of mixing cereal and legumes together and how that is benefiting the agricultural systems in terms of reducing the kind of chemical input we would add, and also reducing the outputs in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but also nitrogen leaching, which are like huge, they cause a lot of environmental issues in conventional agriculture. But also we have some of the trialists we're working with, farmers are growing intercropping in organic systems. So adding again these legumes is a really good way to boost the kind of nitrogen content of the cereal. It has multiple benefits, not only for the plant partner, but also for the soil and also for the pollinators. So it's a wonderful way to practice sustainable agriculture. So yes, I didn't say what this was. This was faba bean. So these were shown earlier, faba bean with wheat, and these were grown over winter, and it really worked wonderfully, actually. As it had been said before, faba bean is kind of great at sort of adapting to the weather conditions in the UK. And then the wheat usually tends to have a higher content of nitrogen, even if we're adding fewer chemical inputs, and also fewer nitrogen losses in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but also in terms of leaching. So this is lupin. This is a spring lupin and wheat. We grew them this spring, and they were actually quite wonderful in terms of sort of coping with weather, and we were really lucky, I guess, because we drilled them quite late, but they did really well. On the other hand, our soybean, as it has been said, some of the legumes are really difficult to grow in the UK, and it was very difficult to, after drilling, it had a lot of problems, and they're actually still in the field at the moment because the weather was too damp, not warm enough, and so I think we're kind of near crop failure at this point. But that's the purpose of research, is kind of trying things out and see what help works. So this is my current project then at the University of Reading, where we're doing a lot of field trial, and we're also collaborating with farmers across the UK. And for my PhD, I did my PhD in Scotland at James Hutton in the University of Edinburgh, and I was very much interested in looking at rather than having a field or like a market garden, I was wanting to look at the interactions between the two plants you're growing together, so the cereal and the legume. In this case in Scotland, so barley is really important, and also peas. So I was growing these plants indoors, and I was kind of really interested in, so we know the benefit of legumes, growing legumes with another crop. It's the nitrogen, because they're nitrogen fixers. They are, in their roots, they have these symbiotic relationship with rhizobia, which are able to fix atmospheric nitrogen into the soil. This kind of boosts the plant's productivity. So I was wanting to look at the system beyond just the nitrogen cycle, but rather looking at carbon. Does this intercropping system, could it be beneficial in terms of carbon sequestration? But also, if you add more carbon to the soil, you're also helping the soil structure, so organic matter, retain nutrients and other benefits. So I was particularly interested in this kind of plant-soil interactions. I don't want to bore you with this, but the idea is that basically without the soil wouldn't exist, I guess, without the plants. The plant wouldn't exist without the soil. And I was really interested in this plant-soil interaction, because what happens is the plant is going to fix carbon through photosynthesis. Some of the photosynthates are going to go below ground in the roots. And up to 20% of the carbon fixed by the plant is going to go in the roots, and it's going to be leaked in the soil, and the little microbes are going to take it because it's really delicious, and it's very easily accessible and decomposable carbon. Basically, it's literally energy. They're getting energy from the sun through the plant, and that is going to be the energy that's going to help them fuel soil organic matter turnover. And as a result, you're going to get these nutrients that are in the soil organic matter liberated, because the microbes are working to acquire extra nutrients, which ultimately benefits the plant. And so I kind of wanted to know, basically, okay, we have this plant, we have this rhizosphere, which is a hotspot of microbial activity. What do we know actually about plant-soil interactions when you're intercropping or when you're mixing cereal and legumes together? We knew that having plant diversity was increasing how much microbes you have, so the microbial biomass. It could change the composition of the microbial community. But what I was particularly interested in was to know whether it's going to change, okay, how much there is of the microbes, okay, the composition, okay, what about the activity of these wonderful microbes in the plant rhizosphere? And I was particularly interested in soil organic matter, and I'm sure you know loads more about soil organic matter than I do. So what I found was that growing these plants together, so the barley and pea together, was increasing the microbial biomass. Wonderful. It wasn't necessarily changing the microbial community, at least with the method I used, but it was changing, that's more interesting, it was changing the active component of the microbial community. What you need to know is that in soil, a lot of the microbes are dormant, and they're kind of just waiting for carbon to arrive. And once they have the carbon, they wake up, they do their wonderful work, the plant benefit, the soil benefit, everyone is happy. So what I found was that if you're increasing the diversity, and it was especially including the legumes, you were having a more active microbial community. And what was happening was that what I talked about, what we call root exudate or rhizodeposit, so these carbons that are going into the soil, were more diverse. So the microbes were more interested in eating what was being leaked in the soil by the plants. It was a more diverse diet, rather than decomposing the soil organic matter. So decomposing the soil organic matter is good in a way, you liberate nutrients, but it's not as great because you liberate carbon. So what was happening was that the microbes were more interested in eating what the plant was delivering instead of decomposing soil organic matter, which would ultimately result in liberating carbon. So essentially I saw that there was less decomposition of soil organic matter because the microbes were eating what was being delivered by the plants. Yes, another interesting finding was that the history, so the soils I used were quite different. And in the soil that had been managed Yes, take home message. If you for example integrate legumes into your market garden, one of the potential effect is that you could also at the same time build soil organic matter and reduce soil organic carbon emissions. So you're kind of increasing sequestration. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wow, that was really good. It was really quick, but really kind of. I know, but I feel like I was capturing your energy, kind of like the soil organisms get the energy from the roots, and I was getting it from you, and we were all in this big energetic loop. It was great. Okay, so Izzy, following on, Isabel's going to talk about our work around varietal selection of legumes for organic systems specifically.
That was my cue, sorry.
It can mean various things.
Yeah, as a time filler, Nick's going to explain the origin of the word hodmedod.
So Hogmedod, this can go on, so I can fill in plenty of time. It's an East Anglian dialect word. It most often means a hedgehog or otherwise a snail, depending which part of East Anglia you're in. Can also mean curly hair, it's called hogmedods. Ammonites are called hogmedods. And what all of these things have in common is that they're sort of round and curled up. So a hogmedod is essentially something round and curled up. And we liked the word, and we liked when we started hogmedods, we liked the word, we liked hedgehogs, and we felt it reflected our sort of East Anglian heritage, a sort of forgotten part of our East Anglian heritage, like some of the pulses, but also with a bit of a stretch of the imagination, you could call a bean or a pea a hogmedod as it's sort of curled up in its pod. So yeah, that's a hogmedod. Didn't go on for as long as I needed to actually. Oh, I've got something else to say about hogmedods. More over this side of the country, I've just remembered that, strangely, a hogmedod in Wiltshire apparently means a scarecrow, but I've got no explanation of what the connection is between scarecrows and snails or hedgehogs. And also in East Anglia, there are similar dialect words, so sometimes a snail is called a dodman or a hodman, so there are sort of variants on the hodmedod version of the word, but I am now exhausting my knowledge of the East Anglian dialect.
Oh, good. Thank you. Yes, a question. Is this about dialect or pulses? Either one, we're welcome.
Wow. No, it was about pulses and drying pulses. So
Sure.
I guess it's just, so I've mainly seen like fava beans and chickpeas and things like that farmed in the Middle East, where, as you say, like they just dry them on the plants and it's fine. But I wondered in the UK, at what point, like how mature do they have to be to harvest them, and how much can you dry them off the plant?
Yeah, good question. I was actually have it on my list too, just about post-harvest processing, what's kind of involved. Yeah.
So pulses, the moisture that they need to be below to be safe and keep well is 16%. So you need to be looking at maximum 16% for the moisture content. If they're going to be split, which is then a sort of extra process, they really need to be under 14, because otherwise they don't split effectively. And there is also a lower bound, because if they're too dry, if they're down to 11 or so, then if you try to split them, they just shatter and you get sort of small pieces of pulse. So if they're harvested in ideal conditions after a good sort of, if they're fully mature and there's been a good sort of reasonably dry spell and they're harvested in dry conditions, they will often come in under 16%, which is great. Otherwise, they can be, possibly up to 20, low 20s is getting a bit higher than you'd really want to ever harvest them. But they can be dried down with ideally ambient air, very carefully with warm air, because if the air is too warm, then you can actually cook the pulses, which isn't the type of cooking you want to be doing. It basically just sort of hardens them and makes them impossible to cook later on.
How can you tell the percentage?
Well, if you're really experienced, you can tell just by biting them and getting a sense of how moist they are, or you can use a moisture meter.
Yeah, cool. Because we had quite good success once trying some runner beans that had gone over, which I think was Scarlet Emperor or something, but anyway, we got the wrong variety by mistake. It's old variety, and we tried them in a dehumidifier, and they still really well done. It's, yeah, on slow dry thing.
Great.
Yeah, I just wondered if that was a really small scale thing, and you can just like bung them into your nursery and just leave them in there drying for a bit.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Yeah. We'll carry on with that. I think after at the end then. Yeah. So keep thinking of the questions, and yeah, Izzy, do you want to talk a little bit about live seeding?
Yeah, so I'm from the Organic Research Centre, and we are doing a project as part of live seeding called LiveBean, and also operate as well. So live seeding is a 4-year European Horizon project, which is trying to increase the availability of organic seed of diverse cultivars into organic farming systems. And there's 16 different partners across Europe, and in the UK we're focusing on winter wheat and spring beans. And then the Operate project is a thematic network of partners all across Europe trying to find alternatives to pesticides in agricultural production. So yes, we're doing we did a spring bean plot trial this year. There were several trial failures in previous years. This was, we think, due to the lack of varieties of spring beans, and also due to the varying weather. So we thought that we'd reduce the farm variation factor and do a plot trial where we can really test the difference between the varieties and how they perform in an organic system. So the plot trial was at Home Lacey in Herefordshire, and these are the varieties and then the 2- and 3-way blends of the varieties within the plot trial. So we monitored the plot trial at 4 key growth stages of the spring beans, and some of the assessments we did included biomass scoring, the ground cover of the spring beans, disease and pest occurrence, root nodulation, so that was looking at the colour and the number of root nodules, and then the number of flowers on the spring beans followed by the pods per stem. So we tested these to really see how the varieties were performing. So the biomass scoring was important to find out the vigour of the spring bean plant. So we found that early vigour was really important, especially in an organic system, for the spring bean varieties to get ahead of the weeds and outcompete them. We are trying to produce the standardised protocol for farmers to be able to use, and also to be able to do more strip trials across different farms in the UK. And we're developing a biomass score as well as part of the trials, so that farmers would be able to use easy to use photographs of how they would score their spring bean vigour. So one of the big challenges with growing spring beans in the UK is managing soil-borne diseases, and particularly Fusarium foot rot. So we had a PhD student called Bassam Attar from Newcastle University who is looking at Fusarium foot rot, and you can see on the picture on the left that it completely blackens the root and reduces all the rootlets. So this really affects the yield of the spring bean plant and reduces its overall health as well. So Bassam came to the plot trial and he took soil samples to measure the DNA, if there was any varietal difference in the soil DNA between the varieties. So there could possibly be varietal difference between varieties having prevalence of Fusarium foot rot. It can last in the soil for up to a decade, and then when a variety is planted, it can come up. So yeah, we were testing which varieties were less susceptible to it. So just about some of the results, we found that Futura had the highest biomass score, so it had really early vigour at the start of the trial, and then it also had the greatest yield as well. And then this was followed by 2 of the blends, so there's a Viper and Victus blend and then a Viper, Victus and Lynx blend, which actually had a higher yield than the individual varieties themselves. So we're putting this down to possibility that the characteristics of these varieties complement each other, so we're going to investigate that further. And so we didn't have any trial failures. There weren't any varieties that really did badly. There was Louis bean, which suffered quite heavily from rust and had a lower yield. And so we found that the biomass is a really important characteristic to measure, so the early vigour and also the leaf angle of the bean plants as well, to be able to outcompete the weeds. And then the number of flowers is a good indication of the yield as well, because it in turn means that there'll be an increased number of pods. So we hope from this trial that we'll be able to really narrow down on the protocols that are needed to measure spring beans, and also produce easy to use resources for farmers to be able to assess their vigour and other characteristics as well of spring beans.
Thanks. So I think we've got a little bit of time now left for questions. So do we have any questions from the room? Oh, good. There's a woman at the back with her hand. Yes, waving around. Yeah.
I wrote it down.
Yeah, speak louder. Yeah.
Back at the beginning, you were talking about things that could be grown in market gardens, say, or on a smaller plot, and you were sort of suggesting ones that had that higher financial yield. But I wonder, in general, we have a 1 acre plot, and we're really terrible capitalists, so we're not terribly worried about selling things for a lot of money. But what we want is lots of beans that we can give our customers. So what are the ones that would just give us the biggest yield in terms of numbers of beans? Is that the same as these ones that are financially viable?
Oh, right. Yeah. Do you want to take that one, Nick? Do you know the relative yield?
I can't give you any detailed yield comparisons, but I would say so there's the yield. The yield is one thing, but the other key thing is how labour intensive the crop is, and that's really the big difference between the sort of lower value field crops, where the labour is minimal because they're grown on a field scale, harvested by combine, and the market garden, the ones I was talking about, the Phaseolus beans, where they might be more suited to growing in a market garden. They are completely at the other end in terms of the amount of labour that's required, because they need to be sown by hand, tended, and then harvested, podded, sorted potentially. So the different varieties, I'd recommend probably avoiding some of the small white varieties, because they are susceptible to staining, and then although the staining generally doesn't mean they're not good to eat, it's something that customers likely feel unappealing. But the more coloured varieties can be easier on that front. But there is a very labour intensive process. The yield, you would get a higher yield, certainly if you were going to do a sort of acre comparison, which to the extent that makes any sense, comparing sort of yield per acre in a market garden with an arable field, you'll get a higher yield from the market garden varieties, and you should get a good yield. Again, I'm not an expert on market gardening, so I couldn't tell you how it compare with other market garden crops, but you would get a lot of beans. I mean, some of the beans, particularly the runner beans, they're very vigorous, as I'm sure you know. They're very vigorous plants and will produce a lot of pods, and you'll get a lot of beans out of the pods. And the runner beans also have the advantage of being quite large beans, which means they're that little bit less labour intensive to handle and sort. So when I was talking about the prices, those are very much sort of ex-farm prices for unsorted, uncleaned beans. If you're producing in a market garden directly to sell to a customer, then the value, so the little packs I passed around, the larger packs of the field pulses, those retail at just over £2 a pack, and they're 500 gram packs. Those small packs of rare beans actually retail for £5 for the smaller pack. So they are, really very high value, because they are precious beans. So that's probably a more useful indication of the difference. Not, you may not be worried about the actual value, but in terms of how much your customers might prize them and appreciate them, people do. Yeah, I mean, a pack of those really special, beautiful beans is a very valuable thing, not just in monetary terms, but as a beautiful food.
Yeah, great. This one up here.
I was just going to do a shameful plug off the back of that question. question. I work for the seed sovereignty programme, and we're doing lots of trials with farmers. And my colleague Richie has been doing some dwarf bean trials for the last few years. So if there's interest in a dry bean trial for market gardens, then reach out to your regional coordinator and they'll make it happen. So there's definitely stuff that can support you.
Okay. Did everyone hear that? Well, it was a shameless plug from the Seed Sovereignty Program. I didn't hear the rest of it though.
The Gaia Foundation Seed Sovereignty Program.
Oh yeah, yeah.
We actually do work with a couple of
Yeah.
stuff there.
And were you just saying, are you always looking for growers to trial different varieties?
We run trials each year. So my colleague Richie leads on that. We've been doing dwarf bean trials, working with different market gardens to find varieties that produce high yields and are suitable in different regions of the UK and Ireland. And if there's interest for a dry bean trial, perhaps we could work in collaboration with folks to come up with something, and potentially for the future. You know, these are just ideas, but if you are interested more in finding out about the work we do as well, just reach out to us, because we do trials and things around yield. So.
Great, yeah. That's right. Our gentleman at the back, the sound guy. Are you the sound guy?
I am.
You're multi-talented. Yep. Question.
When you were talking about fava beans, is that what I know as broad beans?
Oh, are fava beans broad beans?
Yeah.
Is that what you're asking? Yeah. I think a broad bean is a fava bean.
I don't want to hog the question.
Yeah. 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 But they're grown on field scale, dried. Yeah. And yes, we have another one. I think you're the only one so far. Yeah, at the front. Yeah.
Okay. I was just thinking about timing. So I think for us, like, we would consider like doing a crop of beans indoors, because we tend to get a bit of a space opening up in our polytunnels around the summer. But I was wondering about the timing, because our spring cropping kind of comes out. But if you did it, I know it's going to vary a bit on latitude, but if you say we're trying to grow runner beans for drying in a polytunnel, might you get away with a slightly later sowing and then have them out by September, in your experience, do you think? Maybe.
So when you say later sowing, when are you talking about?
I guess if you had them down in June, like,
I think beginning of June
Yeah.
you should get away with. End of May, yeah. I mean, end of May should under protection should be fine. And under protection, you've got more flexibility at the other end, because they're going to be protected from the rain. So even if it gets cold, as long as they've largely matured, they can then sort of senesce and dry even once it's not so warm. So there is, I think I brought it. There's an excellent book about beans, which would be a much better source of information than me on any of the technicalities of growing them. Yeah, I have, which is Susan Young's book, Growing Beans, and yeah, does what it says on the tin, on the cover.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you both, Imelda and Isabel. So Imelda, you've been talking about in two species growing together, intercropping, and you mentioned about two varieties of the same species. So I was just wondering about diseases. Did either of you notice any benefits from those mixes, either the species mix or varietal mix or species mix, for disease incidents? Any comment on that?
So as part of the project, we are looking at disease. We're looking at aphids, for example. What's not quite disease, but they're pests. So normally there's a lower occurrence of pests with your mixing. And we're going to conduct a little experiment actually with colleagues at the University of Reading, who are using AI to detect disease on wheat. And the hypothesis is that if you're creating a physical barrier by using different, because you talked about architecture, I think leaf architecture and things like that. So if you have a diversity and you're basically creating barriers to a disease to spread, where in monocultures you would normally have, it's just like they can just spread very quick. Here, when you're diversifying, you're also creating physical barriers, so the disease doesn't spread as much. And yeah.
And did you notice, do you think you noticed any difference in the disease incidence when you mixed two varieties for what you were observing?
I wouldn't say that there was less disease incidence, but I mean, if you were planting a field of beans and you had a mix of varieties in there, then if you just planted Louis bean, they'd be completely wiped out with rust. And so just guaranteeing some sort of yield, it's wise, I'd say, to mix up the varieties. And especially as we found with the blends as well, they had higher yields, so you're kind of guaranteeing that whatever the year is, whether it's, you know, a wet winter, that there's going to be a successful variety within that, rather than just betting your chances on one variety.
Yeah, so that's always a benefit, isn't it? To eat, well, intercropping or the varietal mixes. Yeah. I guess with you though, maybe you probably don't want mixes of varieties. Because you have quite a specialized product, right? It's probably like a single variety in a bag, I guess.
Well, not entirely. We're always keen for farmers to work with bicrops or polycrops because of all the benefits that have been talked about. It can be challenging when it comes to processing because for the most part you do need to separate them. Although we have actually in the past had some maslin crops where we've just used the crop as a mixture and then actually milled that to produce a maslin flour, which is something, it'd be nice to do more of that. It does bring complexities in all sorts of ways. The processing lines aren't really set up to deal with mixtures. You know, they like to look at a single thing to try and isolate that, and even when you get to the sort of food labelling end, there's a problem if you don't know what the exact composition is of the food that you're selling. But still, be good to pursue that and try and do more of it. I was actually talking over lunch about a tradition in Jersey where there's a thing called they grow a lot of, or historically they've grown a lot of beans in Jersey. They have a slightly more favourable climate than us. And there's what's called the Jersey crock. The Jersey crock is actually like a sort of stew made of lots of different Phaseolus varieties which are mixed together. And they are actually grown together as well, so that's like a sort of bean maslin. And we recently discovered that they did grow field beans in that mixture as well, and the field beans acted as a sort of scaffold for the Phaseolus beans to grow up in the field. So yeah, there's lots of exciting possibilities there, and even at the end of selling them as a product, I think there's lots of potential to do more of that. But yeah, as I said, there are complexities that need to be worked around.
Great. Have we got any more questions out there? Oh, Stephen, yeah.
Yeah, Stephen Jacobs, Organic Growers of the Islands and Organic Farmers and Growers. Quantities for trials. So I don't like plot trials for organic because you get such a large variance in germination, etc. So I like to see broad scale agriculture, a nice long strip, maybe 50 kilos of seed, you might get a ton of grain at the end. What about pulses, and what about those in market gardens? Can you get a handful? Is it worth it? What, any suggestions?
For what sort of like a
For
reasonable...
that you could get a demonstrable, at the end of it you can go, yeah, I think that might have worked, or not.
Do you have any thoughts on that, on this sort of the size of the plots you need to...
Yeah, I mean, our plots, there wasn't a huge yield from them, but I guess it was just mostly research based.
But what sort of quantity of seed did you use? Kilos?
Oh, I can't remember off the top of my head. We had like 20 metre strips of seed, of plots, and then 40 plots. Kilograms of seeds.
Yeah, I'm not sure the seeding rate would, but I don't know.
One to look up later, maybe.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that one too. I mean, we do, variety. So are you saying you don't have a lot of confidence in the variety trials, like wheat's something you're very familiar with?
It's just because the conventional trials, certainly for cereals, are so manicured that any representation of reality is a distant dream.
They're tiny, yeah.
But for people with polytunnels or whatever, can you sow a line? Is you going to get some, that's just how I think.
Maybe there's no single answer to that, Stephen. That's what I'm going to say. Any other questions? I would just, oh, good, yep.
Sorry, so we grow about 6 acres of field scale crops, and we don't currently do beans in our rotation, basically because we grow in North Wales where it's reliably wet and cool in August and September. But we do have 2 of our 7 years of rotation are very sort of heavy on clovers and other legumes to fix nitrogen. Theoretically, if we were to slot in beans into our rotation, could there be a chance of sort of problems from having, then 3 out of our 7 years all being legumes? Or is that probably okay?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Oh, you mean in addition to the clover phase?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, with disease, possibly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Root diseases. I don't know. I don't know. Do you know
I don't really know a lot about the disease build-up, but you definitely get problems if you grow peas too often. Fields can get sort of pea fatigue, and then just be no good for growing peas, sometimes for many, many years afterwards. I've never heard of problems with different legumes, so clover and beans, for example. As far as I know, there's not any issue there, because although they're legumes, they're not very closely related within the legume family. And field beans should grow even in North Wales. They're harvested relatively early. They don't have the problems that the Phaseolus beans do. The problem that you're likely to have with field beans is there is a horrible pest called the bruchid beetle that attacks field beans, which is very prevalent. It arrived in Britain only about 15 or 20 years ago, but it's now very prevalent. So you will probably find that your beans have little holes in.
or little larvae in them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so good for the protein content, maybe? Yeah. I was just thinking your question through a little more. And yeah, I mean, we worked on research trials when I was at the university a few years ago, where our organic rotation was 50% legume, basically, by your accounting, 3 years of a glass clover, and then later on another year of beans. I wasn't aware that was causing any problems, really.
No, but there's work at the James Hutton in Scotland where I guess the weather might not be that different from Wales. But yeah, they're doing that kind of research, and there's a guy called P.T. Unata at the James Hutton looking at that kind of sort of, if having too many legumes is a bad thing. But from the soil perspective, actually, that would be wonderful. And there's a crop rotation experiment that has been going on for like 10-15 years at the James Hutton in Scotland, where they have crop rotations that include different types of legumes, and the soils I used for my experiments were coming from there. And so, for example, some of the soils that had been managed in a sustainable way, so reducing tillage and including amendments and stuff like that, having that diversity of legumes was even more boosted, basically, because you're creating this ideal environment for your microbial community. So it kind of, you get a benefit from that, essentially. So I would say the more nitrogen you're feeding to the microbial community, the better.
Great. Any other questions? Oh, there's another one. Yeah.
Quick one about that beetle that makes
Bruchid?
holes in we see it in our broad beans. Does that affect the viability of it as a seed, like germination, or like how successful the plant will be?
Yeah. I actually was just reading about that the other day. I think it may, depending on sort of how busy that larva is. Yeah, inside the bean. Yeah, and which bit of it devours when it's in there. If it devours a crucial growing point, I think. Yeah.
If you're getting it on a big scale, I've heard people talk about freezing the dried beans to prevent it from developing any further. But do you find on a big scale that it's too late? How do you manage that on a bigger scale?
Freezing.
Same with broad beans, if that's one of the things.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, whenever I've encountered it, it's already gone. You've already got the hole. But I don't know. In your experience, if it's sometimes still in there.
So they can still be in there at harvest, but they do generally emerge as the bean is sort of reaching full maturity and dryness. Although sometimes after harvest, you get the beetles coming out of the beans. So when you're talking about freezing, is that to avoid having the problem? So I didn't quite.
So we've just on our farm, we just seen some of our broad beans this year just to see if it works, and a lot of them have obviously got those either holes
So
Stop
But he
it.
said if you
yeah, so they don't.
dried beans in the freezer, it arrests it. And
It doesn't. They don't come out of the seed. They overwinter in hedgerows. So you won't. It's not from the seed that the beetle originates.
No, but she means
I
if
know,
it's
but
still
then
in
it
there.
gets put in and then it turns into a grub and then it eats its way out, right?
Just to stop it.
You could.
Just to stop it.
Yeah, if you froze them, they wouldn't come out.
Sorry.
I don't.
I phrased my question badly.
I knew what you meant.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Apparently, yeah, we're time's up. Apparently. Oh wow. Okay, that was really great. Really interesting discussion. Thanks for all the questions. Thank you to our speakers again, and I'm sure you can catch all of us afterwards. So yeah, come on and carry on the discussion.